You're listening to the podcast of The Branch in Ashland, Virginia. How do we achieve perfect peace? In the kingdoms of this world, we sometimes revert to violence in order to try to achieve that perfect peace. But what about the upside down kingdom? How do we find true and lasting peace there?
When you were a child, did you have a game that is like imprinted upon your head, whether it was a board game or outdoor game? Is there one that you played constantly, that like any chance that you got that somebody said, hey, let's play a game, you just went right to that game? I was the youngest of cousins on both sides, but I have cousins that are like 16 years older than me, so I was always bringing up the rear and seeing them play games. I remember going to my aunt and uncle's house, and he had a really nice chessboard kind of set aside, and I would just longingly watch all my older cousins play chess and wish that I could do the same thing. But then there were a few games like that. The other game, I have a brother who's a few years older than me, and he always would play Risk. Did anyone ever play the game Risk? It was like one of those games that, you know, if you made it to the end, you feel like you actually did well, right? Because it would take a long time. Didn't quite take as long to set up, but sort of like the game of life, that like the Mattel game of life, right? But you know, the Risk, the description on the box is that it's the game of strategic conquest. And if you haven't played it before, it's basically a fun way to conquer the world. I mean, you know, you basically, you go around and you roll dice to build up your armies and to attack your neighbors, and then to take over their territories. So by the end of the game, you win if you've conquered the world. It's like Pinky and the Brain, right? Like, what are we going to do tonight? We're going to try and take over the world. So that's what happens in Risk. And I don't think, you know, like so many things when you're young, like things don't make perfect sense, but hindsight's always 20/20, and you look back and you're like, this game is a little warped. I mean, you know, it's like I'm Napoleon and I get to conquer the world. And I think as I began to think about it, I mean, it's a fun game, but the whole premise again is that you're conquering with war and violence. That you're going to overtake people, you're going to kill their troops, and then you're going to expand into their territory. And, you know, it made me realize that that's really the way that the world looks at conquering and war. That the way to overtake somebody, or the way to either defend yourself, or the way to beat up on other people is through war and violence. You know, and we've seen that in history, from the very first recorded war in Mesopotamia up to modern times, where we see conflicts in Russia and the Middle East. Violence is the main means by which we defend and we conquer. The means by which we maintain or expand the kingdoms of this earth. But over the last few weeks, we've been talking about the upside down kingdom, the kingdom of God, that in the kingdom of God, things are backwards according to the world's rules. That they don't look the way that the world does. So if the world goes in and uses war and violence to expand their kingdoms, what happens in the upside down kingdom? What do peace and war look like in the upside down kingdom? From the early days after God had called his people out from among the nations, he was rescuing them constantly. He was rescuing them from bondage and slavery in Egypt. In Exodus chapter 14, verses 13 and 14, we read this: Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Now, I don't know about you, but verse 14 is a verse that I need to highlight, but I hate it. because A, I don't always trust that the Lord will fight for me, and B, I'm not still very well. I have a really hard time being still. So to say, the Lord, who you don't always see, is going to fight for you, you need only be still, that's a tall order for me. It's a difficult thing to really come to grips with. You see, God went before his people, and then he was with them. We see the Battle of Jericho in the book of Joshua, where instead of fighting with swords, what did they take up? They took up trumpets and horns. Now, some of you who have kids who played brass instruments know that it can be a painful, murderous thing at times in the early days, right? But God said, these are your weapons. You're not going to take up a sword. You're going to take up a trumpet, and you're going to walk around this city, and then you're going to blow the trumpets, and that's how I'm going to deliver this city into your hands. They took nothing but what God had given them, the Ark of the Covenant, the trumpets. And eventually, Israel, though, had an army. Jericho was early on in their history. Eventually, once Israel had a king, they also had an army. Part of me wonders if the two go hand in hand. That when we have a king, automatically we go to army, because as broken, fleshly, sinful people put in the role of king, they constantly want to expand their territory, and the only way they know how to do it is by conquering through war. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. I don't know about you, but my trust in God falters often. And I really think that our trust in God seems to falter when three things tend to happen. First of all, when we can't see his hand. When we want to see what's going on, but we just don't see it. And we've prayed and we've waited on him, but we just can't see any evidence of it. But there's also the impatient among us who God doesn't move as fast as we'd like. And I'm praying, and I wanted an answer yesterday, but he's not giving it to me. So let's go, God. We've got things to do. But then he doesn't move the way we think he should. So even if we see his hand, and even if it's as fast as we'd like, when the end result comes out, we're going, wait a minute, that wasn't what I thought was going to happen. And all three of those things are things that really that my trust in God falters when these things happen. There may be a longer list. We may have other things that we can add to that, but those were the things that came to my mind, that my trust in God seems to falter. When Jesus came to earth, others expected him to usher in the kingdom with violence the way that so many before him had done. I think people's trust in God faltered when Jesus came because it didn't look the way they thought it should. It didn't happen quickly. It happened hundreds of years after he was foretold of. And people didn't see his hand for all that time. And people tried to pressure Jesus into using violence and using force to make things happen, to take over the world. But Jesus peacefully proclaimed his kingdom, and he refused to succumb to violence, even when he was arrested. There in Matthew 26, verses 50 through 54, when Jesus and his followers are met in the garden by Judas and all those armies, this is what we read. Jesus replied, "Do what you come for, friend." And the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he'll at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way. Those words are haunting to me that Jesus says, all who draw the sword will die by the sword. In other words, violence begets violence. Jesus didn't have to use violence to bring his kingdom in. But it didn't happen as fast or the way that others thought. Is it possible that we've become so conditioned to think that violence is the way that we just come to expect it? Is that why we simply change the channel or flip to a new website when we read news about a school shooting or about police brutality or something else? Have we become so callous to a violent way of life? We've been conditioned to just expect it as if it's just, the sun rising and the sun falling. That we just pass over it as if it's nothing. After Jesus, there have been many who have embraced a non-violent approach towards life. There are many systems of belief, many groups of believers who have done that, the Anabaptists, the Quakers, the Amish, others, and then there's individuals. Right? We probably, when we talk about non-violence, we think about Gandhi, or we think about Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King Jr. said this. He says, in the nonviolent army, there's room for everyone who wants to join up. There's no color distinction. There's no examination, no pledge, except that as a soldier in the armies of violence is expected to inspect his carbine and keep it clean, nonviolent soldiers are called upon to examine their greatest weapons, their heart, their conscience, their courage, and sense of justice. And I might add that among the weapons, especially for those of us who consider ourselves to be followers of Jesus Christ, is our faith in God. That too is a weapon against the enemy. Martin Luther King Jr. also said this. He said, nonviolence is a powerful and just weapon which cuts without wounding and ennobles the man who wields it. It's a sword that heals. Kind of wrap your head around that a little bit. It's a sword that heals. Right? It does the very opposite. This is the upside down kingdom. So things are not as they seem. Now, while there may be instances when violence is called for, is it possible that we move too quickly to war and violence to achieve peace? But what is peace? What is peace for us? Is it simply the absence of conflict? Is it simply the absence of violence? The Hebrew word shalom, which is often translated peace, is far broader than that in its description. Here are some of the definitions of that word, shalom. Tranquility, welfare, health, prosperity, safety, soundness, peace from war, quiet, friendship, contentment, and completeness. We started off the service reading from Isaiah 9, something that we probably might be used to reading during, like I said, the Advent season. The foretelling of Jesus through the prophet Isaiah was that he would be the Prince of Peace. But do we fully understand that sometimes the peace that is brought is not the peace that we like or expect? Maybe we just don't like conflict. We don't like war, but that's not the full picture of what the peace that the Prince of Peace brings is. Jesus was honest about the fact, though, that while he may be the Prince of Peace, he was actually going to bring disruption as well. He said this in Matthew chapter 10, verses 34 through 39. This is what Jesus said. He said, "Do not suppose that I've come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I've come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Wow. Jesus said that he came not to bring peace. It's one thing to bring peace where peace is needed. But Jesus disrupted the norms. He disrupted the status quo. But what do we do with a passage like this? And also what we read at the beginning of the service, and then also what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, right? What did he say? Blessed are the what? The peacemakers. Well, how do we reconcile all this together? What does he mean here? First of all, this passage from Matthew 10, tell me we're not seeing that firsthand in today's day and age. We're seeing mothers against daughters and fathers against sons, mother-in-laws against daughter-in-laws. But the problem is that what we're seeing today is not a belief thing. It's not a following after Jesus thing. It's a political thing. We're letting things get in the way of us and our family that shouldn't be getting in the way. It's one thing if Jesus is the reason for that disruption, that lack of peace. But if it's other things, should that really be the case? The reason why Jesus talks about this dissension is because people refuse to accept him as the Lord, as the King, as the Messiah. And that sometimes is enough to cause dissension in a family. I appreciate what pastor and author John Piper says about this passage because I think it brought clarity for me. It's a longer quote here. But he said this is what Jesus meant by bringing a sword, not peace. It means he comes into the world as the supreme beauty and supreme joy, supreme value of the universe. And he comes with absolute supreme authority, and therefore he claims in every family, every business, every school, and every church, every political party, and every nation, a superior allegiance, a superior love. And so with the sword of his supremacy, he cuts every affection, every allegiance to family or business or school or church or political party or nation which would compete with him for supreme place in our hearts. What's competing for a supreme place in our hearts? And what are we willing to push aside there when it comes to Jesus being at the center? Are we willing to give up our political parties, our ideologies, our thoughts? Are we sometimes willing to give up family even to let Jesus reign supreme in our hearts? Look, I'm not standing up here as a great, perfect practitioner of this either. This is hard stuff. To say that Jesus is the supreme and everything else, like he said, like anyone who's not willing to put aside mother or father or son or daughter or whoever to follow me. These are hard words. This is why so many people said, okay, Jesus, you're not for me. But the peace that Jesus brings, it's a disruptive peace because people don't want to achieve peace the way that he tells them that they must. People want to fight against that peace. No one wants to be told, hey, in order to really achieve this peace, you need to give yourself over completely to the one who created you, to the Lord of the universe. We're rebellious creatures. We fight against that all the time. We don't want to be told what to do. We don't want to be told that we might have to give something up in order to experience true peace. We are rebellious creatures who want to be autonomous in our decision making, and we're not willing to give that up. But peace doesn't come through rebellion, it comes through surrender and sacrifice. And that surrender and sacrifice is not to a political party. It's not to an ideology. It's not to a system of government or any other kind of man-made system. It's to the only one who can bring us true peace, the King of the upside-down kingdom, and that's Jesus. That's it. If you want to experience true and lasting and perfect peace, the only way to do that is through Jesus. It's not Jesus plus something else. It's not Jesus plus being a Republican or a Democrat. It's not Jesus plus your ideologies on this. It's Jesus, and that's it. Perfect peace will only be achieved through the Prince of Peace, and one day we will experience that. The prophet Isaiah foretold of a future that would be free of war, free of conflict. He said in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They'll beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Can you imagine that day? Where there's no more conflict, where nations aren't going against nations, where families aren't going against families. Because we've understood that the only way to find true and lasting peace is through Jesus Christ. And the tension of all this is what we'll continue to say throughout this entire series, that we are people of the kingdom living in the world. That is conflict. We have upside down values in a world that thinks we should be thinking the other way. We are people of the kingdom living in the world, and there's a tension there. And we need to still abide by God's rule and God's law. If we want to see the kingdom of God expanded, if we want to be part of that, the growth and movement of the upside down kingdom, then we had best not try to expand that kingdom the same way that the world's kingdoms try to expand. Because if we try to expand the kingdom of God the same way that the world's kingdoms expand, then it will begin to look drastically different from the kingdom that Jesus has proclaimed, the kingdom that Jesus talks about in the Gospels over and over and over again. And so my question for myself, for all of us, is this: will we seek peace through the only lasting means of peace, the Prince of Peace? Will we make him supreme to everything else? Or we seek it another way? If we seek it another way, everything else will pale in comparison. And nothing else will fully reach perfect peace except peace through the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ. These are hard words, but they're true words. Words that I believe. Words that disrupt. Words that make us uneasy. Words that sometimes divide. But best be divided by the words of Jesus than some of the other things that we let divide us in this world, right?
In the upside-down kingdom, things don't always make sense to us, especially in comparison to the kingdoms of this world. The only way for us to find and experience true and lasting peace is through the Prince of Peace, giving ourselves over completely and wholly to Him. We are people of the kingdom living in the world. May we continue to live by God's ways so that we might experience God's peace in the world. Thanks for listening to our podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at thebranchashland@gmail.com. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, give us a review, and share with your friends and family. Thanks for listening. See you next time.